Chapter 31 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 31. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Ephesians 6:13. Without looking to right or left, he strode across the atrium. "A cloak, quickly!" he commanded, as Dion and Nolus, obedient and expectant of orders, rushed forward at his approach. From the triclinium on the right came the sound of loud laughter and the strains of a bibulous song, voices raised in gaiety and pleasure. Taurus Antenor recognized that of Caius Nepos, fluent and mellow, and that of my lord Hortensius Marcius, resonant and clear. To what their revelries meant he did not give a thought. Dia had told him why these men had come to her house. The intrigues hatched 2 days ago over a supper table were finding their culmination now. The Caesar was a fugitive and the people rebellious. The golden opportunity lay ready to the hand of these treacherous self-seekers, and Dea Flavia was to be their tool, their puppet, until such time as they betrayed her in her turn into other hands that paid them higher wage. Taurus Antenor wrapped the dark cloak which Dion had brought him closely around his person. He gave the slaves a mute peremptory sign of silence, and then quickly walked past the janitors, through the vestibule, and out into the open street. The midday light had yielded to early afternoon. It still was gray and lurid, with a leaden mist hanging over the distance, and moisture rising up from the rain-sodden ground. The worst of the storm had passed from over the city, but the thunder still rolled dully at intervals above the Campania, and great gusts of wind drove the heavy rain into Taurus Antenor's face. It seemed to him, as he walked rapidly down the narrow street in front of the Augusta's palace, that the noise from the forum below had gained in volume and in strength. When the raging tempest of rebellion was at its height earlier in the day, he had lain in a drugged sleep, unconscious of the shouts, the threats, the groans which had resounded from palace to palace on the very summit of the Palatine. When he awoke, these terrifying sounds were already more subdued. The people had been driven by the storm-fanned conflagration which they themselves had kindled, to seek shelter under the arcades of the taberna in the forum below. But now, after a couple of hours of enforced inactivity, they were ready once more for mischief. In compact groups of a dozen or so, they were slowly emerging from beneath the shelters. It only needed the amalgamation of these isolated groups for the fire of open insurrection to be ablaze again. Time, therefore, was obviously precious. At any moment now, if the rain ceased altogether, the populace, in no way cooled by the drenching, would once more storm the hill and would discover the fugitive Caesar in his retreat. Already from afar there came to the lonely pedestrian's ear the roar of a mighty wave composed of many sounds, which, gathering force and fury, was ready to dash itself anew upon the imperial hill. But up here on the summit there still reigned comparative quietude. True that as he walked rapidly along, Taurus Antinor spied from time to time groups of excited, chattering men congregated at street corners or under the shelter of a jutting portico, whilst now and then from behind the huge piles of builders' materials which littered this portion of the Palatine, darkly swathed figures would emerge at sound of the prefect's footsteps on the flagstones, and as quickly vanish again. But to these Taurus Antinor paid no heed. They were but the remote echoes of the angry storm below. Soon the majestic pile of Augustus's palace loomed before him on the left, with its unending vistas of marble and porphyry colonnades. On the right was the temple of Jupiter Victor on the very summit of the hill. An undefinable instinct led the man's footsteps to that lonely height. He skirted the temple, and anon stood looking down on the panorama of Rome stretched out at his feet, the Palatine sloping downwards in a gentle gradient, covered with the dwellings of the rich patricians, which formed here a network of intricate and narrow streets. Below these the great circus, redolent of the memories of the past 24 hours. Beyond it the Aventine with the winding ribbon of the Tiber, now lost in a leaden-colored haze. The streets from the valley upwards, all around the hill, were swarming with men, who from this distance looked like pygmies, fussy and irresponsible, spectral too in the rain-laden mist, as they appeared to be running hither and thither in compact groups, but with seeming aimlessness, whilst shouting, always shouting, that perpetual call for vengeance and for death. The watcher looked down in silence, for that crowd of pygmies was the people of Rome, who at a word from him would proclaim him Caesar and master of the world. The immensity of the sky was above him, the far horizon partly hidden in gloom, but down there were the people whose voice was raised to deify their chosen hero in the intervals of demanding the death of a tyrant. And the people were the lords of Rome just now, entrenched in the narrow streets. A crowd, 100,000 or more strong, held the imperial hill in a solid blockade. Down below, in and around the circus, steel and bronze glittered in the distant vapors. 1,000 men of the Praetorium Guard, cut off from the Caesar, had been unable to forge a way through the serried ranks of the populace. Dark masses that lay immovable and stark in the open space around the circus spoke mutely of combats that had been fierce and bloody, but the people had remained victorious. The people held their ground. 100,000 fists and staves, a few agricultural and building implements, had asserted their mastery over 1,000 swords and shields. The people were the masters of Rome, and they had chosen their Caesar in the hero whom they had already deified. Taurus Antinor's gaze swept over the vista that lay stretched out before him. It pictured the entire political situation of the world city, with treachery lurking on the hill, and a determined mob in the valley. The murder of the Caesar was but a question of hours. And after that? After that, the empire of Rome and the dominion of the world for this man who stood here on the watch. He had but to say the word, and that empire would be his. He had but to go back now to find his way with softly treading footsteps to the couch where Dea Flavia's exquisite body lay stretched out in semi-unconsciousness. He had but to take her once more in his arms, to murmur the words of love that, unspoken, seared his lips even now. He had but to close his ears to the still small voice that was God's, and Rome, the mistress of the world, and Dea Flavia, the peerless woman, would be his at the word. Rome and Dea Flavia, the two priceless guerdons of the earth. They called to him now on the wings of the distant storm, from over the hills and from across the gray, dull mist that obscured the sky. The man stretched out his arms with a gesture of passionate longing. How easy it were to take all! How impossible it seemed to give up everything that made life glorious and sweet. A voice, low and insinuating, trembled in the air. Take all, it said. It is thine for the taking, thine by the will of thousands, thine by the call of one pair of perfect lips. Rome, the unconquered queen, Dea Flavia, holding in her white hands a cup brimming over with happiness. All are thine at the word. The silent watcher cried out in his loneliness and his agony. He held his hands to his ears, for the voice grew more insidious and more real. The empire of the world and Dea Flavia, and in the balance, what? An oath rendered to a tyrannical madman, the scourge and terror of mankind, an oath which reason itself doth repudiate with scorn. Even thy God would not exact obedience from thee at such a price. His head fell upon his breast, and his knees bent to the earth. It was all so difficult. It seemed well nigh impossible now. No words escaped his lips. He knelt here, silent and alone, before the face of Rome that but waited to be conquered, before the face of God veiled to his gaze, and around him the distant roll of thunder and the confused shouts of the people from below. Christian, this is thine hour. In silence and in tears thou must make thy last stand against temptation greater, mayhap, than suffering mankind hath ever had to withstand alone. Everything in the man cried out to him to yield, his love for Dea, and his love for Rome, and that pride of manhood in him that calls for power over other men, born and bred in luxury-loving paganism, in the worship of might and the deification of the imperium. The Christian had to choose between the world and the master. The battle was fierce and cruel. Gone now was the consciousness of strength, the dignity of the patrician. Here was but a lonely, wretched human creature fighting the tempter for his own soul. He cowered on the ground. The wild driving rain beat against the tawny masses of his hair, and lashed the proud, stiff neck that found it so difficult to bend. The tearing wind searched the loosened folds of his mantle and the purple silk of his tunic, the emblem of patrician rank. His face was buried in his hands. Heavy sobs shook his broad shoulders. The face of Dea Flavia, exquisitely fair, smiled at him through his closed lids. The warm, mellow masses of her hair entwined themselves around his tear-stained fingers. Her cooing voice called to him with the ineffable sweetness of love. Christian, it is thine hour, and the battle must be fought out in anguish and in loneliness, with no one nigh thee to comfort and to succor, with no one to see the rending of thy soul, or the slow breaking of thy love-filled heart. When thou art lonely and wretched, Dea Flavia had cried in the agony of her wounded love, call on thy God then, and thou wilt find him silent unto thy prayer, and deaf unto thy woe. And the cry was wrung out from the depths of the tortured heart, O God, my God, if thou be willing, take this cup from me. Whilst the man prayed to his God to take his soul into his keeping, ere it become perjured and accursed. But God was silent, because the soul, though racked and tempted, was too great for the tasting of an easy victory. God was silent, but he saw the tears that fell heavy and hot upon the ground. He was silent, but he heard the cries of anguish, the bitter moans of pain. Christian, this is thine hour, for when thy soul and heart have suffered enough, when they have been weighed in the crucible of divine love, and not been found wanting, then will the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, descend in exquisite comfort upon thee. Gradually the tears ceased to fall, the sobs to shake the massive frame of the kneeling man. His hands dropped from his face, and his gaze went up to the storm-tossed firmament, there where land and sky merged in the gray mists of approaching evening. And on the horizon, as he gazed beyond the valley, beyond the Aventine and the murmuring Tiber, already wrapped in gloom, a ray of golden light had rent the lowering clouds. It shone serene and bright, illumined from behind limitless depths by the slanting rays of a slowly sinking sun. Taurus Antinor rose to his feet. He looked and looked upon that light until it tore a wider and ever wider gap in the angry clouds, and its golden radiance spread right across the horizon far away. The very mist now seemed aglow. The waters of the Tiber, tossed by the gale, throw back brilliant sparks of reflected lights. From the low-lying marshes among the reeds, two birds rose in rapid flight, and disappeared in that golden haze. My God, not mine, but thy will be done, murmured the lonely man, and anguish folded its sable wings, and the tortured heart was at peace. End of chapter 31. Recording by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA.
Chapter 32 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy, Chapter 32. For whom the Lord loveth he chastened, and scourged every son whom he receiveth. Hebrews 12, verse 6. The gorgeous palace of Augustus appeared quite deserted when the prefect of Rome finally made his way to the vestibule. He crossed the magnificent inner peristylium, the tall uncut pillars of which, sharply defined against the sky, enhanced its majestic grandeur and its air of mysterious solemnity. As a rule, these vast halls were peopled with scribes, and though shorn of its original imperial splendors, the palace of the great emperor presented at times a certain air of animation and of official bustle. But now these scribes, no doubt awed by the sound of terror and of strife, which must have reached even this hallowed spot, had fled into a more remote portion of the palace, or may have even joined the throngs in the forum, on the principle that 'tis better to form a unit in an angry crowd than to be its butt. The peristylium itself, despite its mute and lonely magnificence, bore traces of the turmoil that reigned throughout the city. There were obvious signs that men had lived and worked here but a very little while ago, that they had been afraid and then had run away. The marble floors were stained with mud. The sedate chairs that usually lined the walls were pushed aside and left to stand crooked and awry, the very mockery of their former dignity. Here and there a roll of parchment, an ink-stained pen, a cast-off cloak littered the hall and looked curiously provocative and out of place, an insult to the majesty of the dead and mighty Caesar, who had caused the stately columns to be reared, and the massive walls to raise their pure lines upwards to the sky. But on all this Taurus Antenor did not pause to think. On his right he heard sounds which proclaimed the presence of men, and thither did he immediately turn his footsteps, peering through the long vista of numberless columns, the further ones of which were merged together in the dim light. He saw that the score or so of the Praetorian Guard, who had escorted the Caesar in his flight, were assembled at the end of the gigantic hall, some lolling against the marble pillars, others lying or squatting on the hard floor, as much at their ease as circumstances would allow. They had not discarded their accoutrements, and each man had his sword by his side. Not realizing that the fury of the mob had been momentarily damped by the storm, they remained prepared to defend the Caesar's life at any moment with their own. More than one of them had apparently been wounded in one or the other of the hand-to-hand combats which they had sustained against the mob earlier in the day. For more than one head was wrapped in a rough piece of bandage, and more than one tunic was stained with blood. All the men looked fagged and dirty, and for the most part worn out with sleeplessness and want of food. As the prefect's firm tread resounded from end to end of the colonnade hall, and woke the slumbering echoes of the deserted palace, weary, lacklustered eyes were turned in his direction. And now when his tall figure appeared between two pillars, the men recognized him, for his head was uncovered. One or two of them gave a cry of terror, since all of them had thought that the prefect was dead, and this tall, dark presence, wrapped in a long cloak, and with tawny hair still dripping from the rain, looked very like an apparition from another world. "The Caesar?" queried the prefect curtly. Some of the men struggled to their feet. The voice they knew well. It was of old, loud and peremptory, and not like to be coming from a grave. All did their best to assume a respectful bearing, and one who was in command made ready to show the prefect into the Caesar's presence. "I want no escort," said Taurus Antinor, in that same commanding voice which no one in Rome had ever tried to resist. "Tell me only where I can find the Caesar." "In the lararium, O Prefect," replied the soldier without hesitation. "He ordered us to remain here." Without looking to right or left, Taurus Antinor walked past the soldiers into the gorgeous tabilium beyond, where great Augustus has been wont to administer justice. This vast hall was deserted, but from an inner room on the left there came to the prefect's ear a curious sound like the snarl of an angry feline creature, a sound which he knew could only come from one human throat. Without hesitation he turned to whence that sound had come. On the right of the huge semicircular apse, which contained the now vacant throne of Augustus, a narrow door led to a small temple-like room which had once contained the great emperor's household gods. A heavy curtain of embroidered silk masked this entrance. Taurus Antinor pushed it back and walked in. The temple derived its light solely from a small opening in the vaulted ceiling. That light, which came down in a narrow shaft, was grey and dull, and failed to penetrate the dark and mysterious corners of the room. Taurus Antinor's eyes were narrowed beneath his frowning brows as he tried to pierce the gloom that lay beyond the shaft of light. He could hear heavy breathing proceeding from there, and the muttering of curses, and anon he was able to spy a bundle of stained silken clothes that lay in a heap, and which seemed to shrink and to shrivel, to tremble and to cower on the altar steps. A bundle of rags and a gleam of flaccid flesh which stood for the majesty of Caesar. All at once there was a raucous cry and a growl as of an animal enraged, and the next second something hot and heavy threw itself with violent force against the prefect. Even whilst the sharp blade of a dagger caught a gleam of reflected light, but Taurus Antinor, well knowing the man whom he had come to help, was fully prepared for the treacherous attack. With a rapid movement he had made a shield of his mantle by winding it closely round his arm, and holding it before his face. The dagger glanced against the woollen material, rendered heavy and sodden with the rain, and Caligula, unnerved by the futile effort, staggered back against the altar steps, while the dagger fell with a sharp sound upon the marble floor. "Traitor," came in hoarse gasps from the Caesar's throat. "Hast come to murder me? Ho, there! My guard! My guard!" He was trying to shout, but terror was evidently choking him. He struggled to his feet, and still trembling from head to foot, made pitiable attempts to work his way round to a place of safety behind the altar, whilst keeping his bloodshot eyes fixed upon the prefect. "Hast come to murder me?" he gasped. I came to place my body at thy service, O Caesar, replied Taurus Antinor quietly. I have been sick for nigh on 24 hours, else I had come to thee before. They told me that thou wast cut off from those whose duty it is to guard thy person, and thou wilt grant me leave, I'll conduct thee to them. Ay, thou art ready to conduct me to my death, thou treacherous son of slaves, snarled the Caesar from behind the safe bastion of the stone altar. I have learnt thy treachery. I, even I who trusted thee. Thou didst lie to me and plan my death, even whilst I heaped uncounted favours upon thee. On my soul, O Caesar, thou dost me infinite wrong, rejoined the prefect calmly. But, an it please thee, I am here to justify myself before thee, though God knows I would wish thee to believe me true. Rather, I am here to serve thee, and thou wilt deign to accept my help in thy need. To accept thy help? Nay, by Jupiter! I would as soon trust myself to the snakes that creep under the grasses of the Campagna as I would place my life in the keeping of a traitor. Had I thought to betray thee, O Caesar, said Taurus Antinor simply, I had not come unarmed and alone. Even the dagger wherewith thou didst threaten my life lies at my foot now, ready to my hand for the mere picking of it. As he spoke he gave the dagger a slight kick with his foot, so that it slid clinking and rattling along the smooth floor, until its progress was stopped by the corner of the altar steps against which the Caesar cowered in abject fear. My guard is in the next room, said Caligula, with an evil sneer. And I call but once, and they will kill thee at my word. That is as thou commandest, and as God wills, said Taurus Antinor. But remember, ere thou strikest, O Caesar, that with my death thou wilt lose the one man who can save thee now. He spoke quite calmly, nor did the tone of deference ever depart from his speech. He stood in the dim light which came in a straight shaft down through the opening above, his splendid person in full view of the Caesar, who still crouched in the shadow. The power of his individuality imposed itself upon the miserable coward who threatened him. Caligula, tyrant and half-crazy though he was, had sufficient shrewdness in his tortuous mind to recognize the truth of what the prefect had told him. Had this man come with evil intent, he would not have come alone and unarmed. Had he wished to gain his own ends, he would have had but to say a word, and the mob had been ready to wreak its desired vengeance upon the Caesar. The people of Rome, resumed Taurus Antinor after a while, seeing that Caligula was silent and more inclined to listen to him, are angered against thee. Thou knowest, O Caesar, what the anger of the people portends. For the moment a violent storm has driven the malcontents away from the vicinity of thy palace. They are congregated under the arcades of the Forum, and nurse there their thoughts of rancour and revenge. Until such time as my wrath overtakes them, broke in Caligula with one of his most evil oaths, I am not dead yet, and whilst I live I'll not forget. Rome shall rue this day in blood and in tears. Vengeance and rancour, sayest thou? And he drew in his breath with a moist, hissing sound like the snakes of the Campagna of which he spoke just now. Vengeance and rancour will overtake the rebels, my vengeance and my rancour, besides which all others shall pale. Rome can wait, I say. The Caesar is not yet dead. The words fell choked and thick from his quivering lips nor did Taurus Antinor attempt to interrupt him. But as the Caesar finished speaking, exhausted and breathing heavily, there was a moment's silence in the room, and through that silence could be heard quite distinctly the call of the people from the distance below. "Death to the Caesar! Death!" Caligula uttered a loud cry of rage and of fear, and struggled to his feet. He staggered forward out of the darkness and into the light, his trembling arms outstretched, his sparse hair plastered against his moist forehead, his eyes, protruding and bloodshot, fixed upon the praefect. "They'll murder me," he cried, as he almost fell on his knees, and only saved himself by clinging desperately with both hands to Taurus Antinor's outstretched arm. "They'll murder me. Save me, O praefect, save me, and I'll heap wealth upon thee, money, honours, power, all that thou dost desire. Save me. Do not let them murder me. I will not die. I will not. I will not. Cowards! Cowards! I am a defenceless man. I will not die. I cannot die. Cowards!" Taurus Antinor had to brace himself up against the sickening sense of almost physical nausea that came over him at sight of this pitiful creature, more abject than any cur. Among the many moments of terrible doubt and still more terrible temptations through which he had fought to-day, this was perhaps the most intolerable, because the worldly man in him cried out against the futility of his own sacrifice. To give up every hope of happiness, every aspiration for the welfare of an entire nation, for the sake of this miserable coward, whose thoughts of self-preservation only alternated with those of maniacal tyranny, seemed indeed insensate mockery. Duty could not possibly lie in this. This base creature worthless life surely could not be weighed in the balance against the countless others which, despite any promises that might be wrung from him now, he would inevitably sacrifice to his own lust for blood and for vengeance. The worldly man, the thinking philosopher, the pagan in fact, faced these propositions and placed them before the Christian. But the time had gone by for mental conflict. The Christian had fought until his numbed soul had almost lost the power of suffering. All he knew now was that he must not reason. He must neither think nor philosophize. The Master whom he had seen with limbs stretched upon a cross in unspeakable agony and humiliation, might also have overturned a Caesar and ruled the world from the heights of a throne. He chose to rule it from the place of infamy, and when his dying lips proclaimed to that same world the supreme finality of its salvation, "It is accomplished," it was not to the sound of triumphal music, with banners flying and the spoils of conquest around. It was to the accompaniment of taunts and of derision, and with body stripped naked before a jeering world. "I have offered thee my service, O Caesar," said Taurus Antinor, with a mighty effort at deference and calm, "and thou wilt follow mine advice. I can shield thee from the wrath of the people until such time as that which has occurred to-day lies buried in the bosom of the past." "What must I do? What must I do?" muttered Caligula between his chattering teeth. He was clinging to the praefect with both hands, for his knees were shaking under him, and he would have fallen had he attempted to stand up alone. "Save me, praefect, save me. Do not let them kill me. I cannot die. I will not, and those cowards would murder me. Wilt trust thyself to me, O Caesar?" "Yes, yes. What must I do?" "Come forth with me into the streets." Wrapped in dark cloaks, the people will not recognize us. They would never expect the Caesar to leave his palace while his life is in danger, and well disguised thou couldst come with me through devious ways to a house I know of on the Aventine, where thou wouldst be safe. But at this suggestion, that he should leave the security of this lonely palace for the open dangers of the street, Caligula's terrors increased tenfold. His teeth chattered more loudly in his head, and his hands on the prefect's arms became convulsive in their grasp. "I dare not go, prefect," he stammered, and it had been pitiable were it not abject to see the look of insane terror which he cast round him. "I dare not go. They will kill me if they saw me, and I don't want to die." "No one would recognize thee," said Taurus Antinor with ill-restrained patience. "Dressed as scribes we can mingle with the fringe of the crowd. The shades of evening will be on us in an hour, and our dark mantles will excite no attention. Have no fear, Caesar. No one would suspect thee of running in the teeth of danger." The tone of bitter irony was lost on the dulled perception of this miserable coward. "I would not dare," he murmured intermittently. "I would not dare." "Then do I take my leave of thee, O Caesar," retorted Taurus Antinor coldly, "for here alone, with but 20 men to guard thee, I can do naught to save thy person from outrage. If I were quite sure that I could trust thee, that is for thee to decide. I have offered thee my services, and if thou not accept them, then I'll crave thy leave to go." "No, no, do not leave me, prefect," cried Caligula with despair, clinging now with all his might to his arm, which every instinct in him told him was staunch in his defence. "Do not leave me. I'll do as thou dost advise. I'll don a slave's garb, and slip out into the street in thy wake. And, after that, thou'll find temporary shelter in a humble house on the Aventine. There thou canst rest for a few days, even while thy legions, distant from here but 3 days' march, I believe, do approach the city." "Yes, yes, my legions," cried the Caesar in a hoarse whisper. "I had nigh forgotten them. They are not far, if I could but reach them." A sudden fire of malicious hatred once more lit up the dull misery of his face. "At the head of my legions I can soon show this miserable rabble who is the master of Rome." "At the head of thy legions, O Caesar," retorted Taurus Antinor firmly, and preceded by a proclamation of universal pardon for all the events of the past few days, "thou wilt make thine entry into Rome amidst the rejoicing of thy people." "Pardon?" hissed Caligula through his set teeth. "Never!" "Yet it is a proclamation of universal pardon necessary for thy safety," said Taurus Antinor with solemn earnestness. "As soon as I have placed thee under the protection of that sheltering roof on the Aventine, I would return to Rome with thy proclamation, and with the news that in 3 days' time thou wouldst enter the city at the head of thy people. The people, frightened at first, would imagine that divine interference had led thee triumphantly out of danger. Thy clemency would allay their fears and fire their enthusiasm. They would soon make ready to welcome thee with rejoicings. But without thy promise of pardon, fear would gain the mastery over those who led this rebellion, and fear quickly would beget despair. In their terror of thy coming vengeance they might oppose thy coming, and such is the temper of the people just now that all the strength of thy legions, half spent in this last expedition, might be powerless against it. thy chosen soldiers even might turn against thee." The Caesar was silent, and even in this dim light it was easy to read on his ghastly face the inner workings of his tortuous mind. Rage, malice, a raging thirst for revenge fought against his own cowardice and the steady influence which the prefect's calm and firm attitude was exercising over him, much against his will. "Time is precious, O Caesar," continued Taurus Antinor earnestly. "The people will not wait. The shadows of evening will soon be drawing in, and the storm has not yet wholly passed away. The hour is propitious now, and thou wilt accept my service. We can slip away and mingle with the few straggling groups of malcontents before the crowd has again rushed the hill. And thou wilt not tarry, and canst brace thyself up to indifferent demeanours in the streets. I swear to thee that thou wilt be under safe shelter in an hour. If I but dare to trust myself so entirely in thy keeping." Taurus Antinor shrugged his broad shoulders with marked contempt, for his forbearance was threatening to give way. "Is there any one else," he asked, "whom thou wouldst rather trust? Name him then, O Caesar, and, alive or dead, I'll bring him to thy presence within the hour." But to this the Caesar made no reply. He knew better than any one could tell him that the man whom he had called a traitor, whom he had twice tried basely to kill, was the one man in the entire patriciate of Rome who would be true to him. Even madmen have such instincts at times. Caligula knew that he was doomed. The cries from below could leave no doubt in his mind that, isolated as he was, cut off not only from his legions, but even from his guard, nothing could save him from the fury of vengeance which threatened him from his entire people. A wave of fatality swept over his maniacal sense of terror. He knew and felt that if this man was a traitor, then indeed could nothing save him. And he knew and felt at the same time that while he was under this man's protection no great harm could come to him. Gradually this sense of fatality got the mastery over his cowardice, and as Taurus Antinor watched the twitchings of that distorted face, he could note that insensibly a resolution to follow his advice had found its way in this madman's brain. "I'll come with thee," said Caligula at last, and now his voice sounded more firm, even whilst his hands released their grip on the prefect's arms, and his short body straightened itself out upon his trembling limbs. "I'll come with thee, but may thy flesh wither on thy bones, thy hands be palsied, and thy eyes become sightless, if thou hast the thought of betraying thy Caesar." To this senseless speech Taurus Antinor vouchsafed no reply. "Then I pray thee," he said quietly, "wait here awhile till I find the necessary garments for thy disguise and mine, and also pen, ink, and parchment." "Pen and ink for what?" "Thy proclamation of pardon, Caesar, signed by thy hand." "When I am in safety I will see to it," said Caligula with sudden blandness. "Thou said it thyself, there is no time to lose." "There is time to fulfil a promise, and time to take what is the most important measure for thy safety," rejoined Taurus Antinor. "Thou dost not trust thy Caesar?" said Caligula with a vicious snarl. "No," was the prefect's curt reply. It was characteristic of this tyrannical despot that at the prefect's rough answer he laughed with obvious satisfaction. At the back of his shrewd sense of self-preservation there had come the thought that the man who had spoken that unequivocal "no" had learned to its fullest the lesson of truth. He said nothing for a while, and when his laughter died away in a kind of hysterical gasp, he made a gesture expressive of indifference and also of submission to the other's wish. Taurus Antinor turned away from the loathsome presence without another word and with a firm step, and Caligula stepped. Chapter 33 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 33. Come, take up the cross and follow me. St. Mark's 10, verse 21. Taurus Antinor had some difficulty in finding the clothes that he wanted, which would serve as a disguise for the Caesar and himself. He had to explore the huge deserted palace from end to end before he came on a block of the slaves' quarters. Here in one of the cubicles he ultimately discovered a few bundles of garments, which had apparently been hastily collected and then forgotten by one of the runaway scribes. These he found on inspection would suit his purpose admirably. Writing tools and desk he had already collected. There were plenty of these littering the building in every corner. Armed with all these necessaries, he made his way back to the lararium without again crossing the peristylium where the soldiers were assembled. Sitting on the altar steps, with the desk between his knees and the light from the narrow shaft above falling full upon the parchment, he wrote out carefully and laboriously the proclamation of pardon which was destined on the morrow to assure the people of Rome that all their delinquencies against the majesty and the person of their Caesar would by him be forgotten. It was necessary so to word it that not a single loophole should remain through which Caligula could ultimately slip and break his word. More than one beginning was made and whole lines erased and rewritten before the prefect of Rome was satisfied with his work. The Caesar, in the meanwhile, was trampling up and down the tiny room like his own favourite Black Panther when it was in a rage, throwing his thick, short body about in a kind of rolling gait. He only paused at times for a moment or two in order to hurl a vicious snarl at the prefect. His fingers were twitching convulsively the whole time, with longings no doubt to grasp the leather-thonged whip which they were so fond of wielding. At intervals he would gnaw his nails down to the quick, with snorts of bridled fury escaped through his pallid lips. But Taurus Antinor went on with his work, absolutely heedless of the Caesar's rage. When the wording of the proclamation satisfied him, he held out the pen for Caligula to sign. He knelt on the floor with one knee, holding up against his forehead, as custom demanded on a solemn occasion, the desk on which rested the imperial decree. He rendered this act of homage simply and loyally, as the outward sign of that sacrifice which the divine master had demanded of him. Faithful to his instincts of petty tyranny, the Caesar kept the prefect of Rome kneeling before him for close on half an hour. All this while volleys of vituperation poured from his mouth against all traitors in general, and more especially against the prefect whom he accused of selling his services only in order to gain his own ends. It was only when Taurus Antinor had reminded him for the third time that he was placing his life in grave jeopardy with all this delay that he ultimately snatched up the pen and put his name to the decree. After that both men donned the dark garments of the fugitive scribe, with the proclamation of pardon rolled up tightly and hidden within the folds of his tunic. Taurus Antinor led the way out of the lararium. The afternoon light was slowly sinking into the embrace of the evening. The vast deserted palace, with its rows of monumental columns and statues of stone gods, looked spectral and mysterious in the fast-gathering gloom. When exploring the building in search of disguises, Taurus Antinor had taken note of the minor exits which gave on the more isolated portions of the imperial gardens. To one of these did he now conduct the Caesar, and suddenly the outer air struck on the faces of the two men, and they found themselves in the open, in the waning light of day, unbroken now by the solid marble walls which had shut out most of the noise from the streets. The shouts that had come from the slopes of the hill struck more clearly upon the ear. The sound travelling through the mist-laden air seemed to come more especially from the northwestern front of the palace of Augustus, which here faces that of the late Emperor Tiberius, with a new gigantic wing built recently thereunto by Caligula. Here a vast multitude appeared to have congregated. The cries of "Death" seemed ominously loud and clear, and through them there was a dull murmur as of an angry mob foiled in its lust. The Caesar uttered a cry of terror, and his knees gave under him. He cowered on the ground, clutching at the prefect's robe and hiding his face in the folds of his mantle. "They will kill me," he stammered thickly. "I dare not go. Prefect, take me back. I dare not go." Taurus Antinor, none too patient a man at any time, had to clench his fists and drive his finger-nails into the palms of his hand, else he could have struck this abject, miserable coward. He wrenched his cloak out of the Caesar's grasp, and with a firm grip pulled him roughly up from the ground. "And thou canst not control thy cowardly fears?" he said harshly. "I'll leave thee to perish at their hands." And holding the wretched man tightly by the wrist, he quickly sought shelter behind a pile of building material which lay some distance away. He hoped that this cringing dastard would not hear that other clamour of the people which invariably followed the call for vengeance. "Hail, Taurus Antinor, hail!" Did these words of perchance reach Caligula's ears, he would no doubt even at this 11th hour have refused to trust himself to the prefect. He would rush back into the palace, like a tracked beast that seeks its burrow, and all the sorrow and the renunciation of the past 24 hours would turn to the bitter fruit of uselessness. Fortunately, Caligula's senses were dulled by his own terrors. He heard the shouts and the ceaseless din of rebellious strife, but the only word that he could distinguish was the ominous one of death. And whenever his words struck upon his confused mind, a violent fit of trembling would seize him, and he would stumble and stagger along like a drunken man. Taurus Antinor, however, held him tightly by the wrist, and thus half led, half dragged him in his wake. The towering masses of the building materials, huge blocks of stone and of marble, scaffolding and ladders piled up on the open ground which encircled the rear of Caligula's palace, afforded him the protection which he had counted on and foreseen. Keeping well within the shadows, he thus gradually worked his way on from pile to pile until he reached the brow of the hill. The crowd which was swarming up the slopes was just beginning to appear in isolated detachments in the roads and streets that led upwards from the Forum. Apparently the mob had not forgotten its former purpose to entrap the fugitive Caesar and to force him to come out and to face his people. The dull evening light creeping up from below, the thin drizzle which had succeeded the heavy rain, and which mingled with the rising vapours from the sodden ground, the aimlessness of the onrushing crowd as it spread itself in confused masses all round the foremost palaces on the hill, all favoured Taurus Antinor's plans. Emerging from behind a monumental block of granite, looking in their dark clothes for all the world like the scribes who had been seen running about here all the day, the two men attracted little or no attention. Their faces in the gloom could not easily be distinguished, nor did anyone in that excited throng imagine for a moment that the Caesar would leave the safe shelter of his palace, and, dressed in slave scarves, affront the multitude who clamoured for his death. The audacity of this flight carried success along with it, dragging the quaking Caesar after him. Taurus Antinor soon plunged into the very thick of the crowd. The tumult here and the confusion were intense, men running and shouting, women shrieking and children crying, all in a tangled mass of noisy humanity. Some of the men brandished sticks, shovels, or rakes, any instrument that they happened to possess. They shouted loudly for the Caesar, demanding his death, urging the more pusillanimous to rush the palace and drag the hiding princeps out into the open. Others carried tall poles on which they had improvised rude banners made of bits of purple-coloured rags. They were proclaiming the new Caesar of their choice in voices rendered hoarse with lustlessness. The women clung to their menfolks, their shrill accents mingling with the rougher ones. Some of them clutched small children to their breasts, others dragged older ones at their skirts, and it was terrible to hear the cries of frightened children through the shouts of vengeance and of death. Now, as the gloom gathered and a few lighted torches appeared here and there, held high above the sea of surrounding heads, they flickered feebly in the damp air, throwing fitful lurid lights on the faces close by. Dark faces, flushed and excited, with sullen eyes and dishevelled hair, above which the black smoke from the sizzling rosin formed weird and shifting halos. The crowd carried the fugitives along with it, pressed shoulder to shoulder in a living, breathing, panting vice. Damp rising from the thousands of rain-sodden garments mingled with the mist and with the rain, and formed a grey, wet, clinging veil over this restless mass, kneading it all together in a dark, swaying entity from which rose the cries of the children and the hoarse shouts of the men. Drifting with the throng, Taurus Antinor, still holding his trembling companion by the wrist, soon found himself being carried down the long flight of steps which leads from the heights crowned by Caligula's palace to the Forum below. Without attempting to work against the crowd, he presently crossed the Nova Via, and, turning sharply on his left, he found himself behind the basilica, whose every arcade and precinct was densely packed with men and women, and whose marble walls echoed and re-echoed with a multitude of sounds. The crowd, always the crowd, Always these shouting men, these screaming women, these puny crying children. It seemed as if their numbers were being fed by invisible masses that came from out of the darkness which was closing in around. On ahead, the height of the Aventine hid the horizontal line from view, and on its slopes tiny lights began to appear that seemed to mock the weary fugitives by their distance and by their elusiveness. Taurus Antinor had all along intended to reach the Aventine by a devious way. Now the crowd had brought him and his companion to the river bank, there where the Tiber winds its sudden curve at the foot of the three hills. The curve of the river would have to be followed its whole way along the bank, and the slope of the Aventine looked so immeasurably far. But progress had become more easy at last. Taurus Antinor pushed his way along now as quickly as he dared. More than one angry glance followed the tall, powerful figure as it forged a path for its burden, regardless of obstruction. More than one oath was uttered in the wake of those broad shoulders that towered above the rest of the crowd, with a man who was shivering as with ague dragging upon his arm, with his body racked with fever and his temples throbbing with pain. The man set out with renewed energy upon his final stage of his journey. In the constant pushing through the crowd, the bandages on his shoulders had shifted, and he could again feel the claws of the panther tearing at his flesh, and the hot breath of the beast scorching his face. The sodden garments clung cold and dank to his skin. He felt chilled down to the marrow, and yet he felt as if the fire of his body would burn his skin onto his bones. Perhaps the physical misery which he endured numbed the more unendurable agony of the soul. Certain it is that kind of torpor gradually invaded his brain, leaving within it only the sensation of a terrible longing to drop down on the wet ground and to yield to the unconquerable desire to stretch out his aching limbs and to lay down his head in the last long sleep which would bring eternal rest. But now the ground had begun to rise. The Aventine stretched out its slopes into the arms of darkness, and its summit was lost in the gloom above. The weary ascent had begun. Then it was that through the torpor of the man's brain a vision had suddenly found its way, searching those memory cells of the mind that contained the sacred picture of long ago. A mountain, rugged and steep, a surging crowd, a man, weary and with body tormented by ceaseless pain, toiling upward with a heavy burden. His naked feet made no noise upon the earth. The burden which he bore was a heavy cross. Above on the summit death awaited him, ignominy and shame. But he walked up in silence and in patience, so that men in long after years, who had burdens of sorrow or of misery, should know how to bear them till they too reached the summit of their Golgotha, there to find, not death, not humiliation or pain, but eternal life and the serenity of exquisite peace. The Caesar hung like a dead weight on Antinor's left arm, and the right one, lacerated by the panther's claws, burned and ached well-nigh intolerably. But the glorious memory of long ago now preceded him, the divine martyr walking on ahead with sacred shoulders bent to the sacrifice, and he seemed to hear again the swishing of the tunic stained with blood and the mud of the road. He seemed to hear the shouts of the jeering crowd, the rough words of the soldiery, the sobs of faithful disciples and women, and he too plodded on with his burden. The crowd, now far away, seemed to mock him for the uselessness of his sacrifice. Dea Flavia's sobs of sorely wounded love called to him to turn back. But memory now would be held back no longer. The picture which had conjured up became more distinct and more real, and its gold-lined wings, as they fluttered around his head, made a murmur gentle and intangible as the flitting of the clouds across the skies of Italia. The murmur was soft and low, and it reached the aching senses of the weary pilgrim like the cooling breath of multitudes of angels in the parched wilderness of his sorrow. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For thy sake, O Jesus of Galilee, said the man as he toiled up his endless Calvary, and left behind him with every step far away in the valley below all that had made the world fair to him and all the promises of happiness. On ahead, the divine leader had fallen on his knees. The burden of his cross seemed greater than he could bear. Rough hands helped to drag him up from the ground and set him once more on his tedious way. His cheeks were wan and pale. Blood trickled from the thorn-crowned brow. But there was no wavering in the lines of the face, though they were distorted with pain. No giving in, no drawing back, not though one word from those livid lips could have called even now unto God. And 10,000 legions of angels would have come down at that word to avenge the outrage and to proclaim his Godhead. And in the wake of his Master the Christian plodded on, dragging his burden on his arm, the cross which he had to bear. Gradually behind him the noise became more and more subdued. Then it died down altogether, all but a confused and far-away murmur which mingled with the sighing of the Tiber. And the Christian was alone once more, alone with memory. Taurus Antinor's breath came in short, stertorous gasps. His throat was parched and his tongue clove to the roof of his mouth. The slope of the hill is precipitous here, and the house, nigh to the summit, seemed to recede farther and farther with devilish malignity, and the sense of silence and of solitude became more absolute, a fitting attendant on memory. On and on the two men walked, the Christian and his burden. Their sandaled feet felt like lead as they sank ankle-deep in the mud of the unpaved road. Come, take up thy cross and follow me. And the Christian plodded on in the wake of the divine presence that beckoned to him upwards from above. From time to time Caligula's hoarse and querulous voice would break the death-like silence. Are we not there yet? Not yet, very soon, the prefect would reply. I am a fool to have trusted myself to thee, for of a truth thou leadest me to my death. Patience, Caesar, yet a little while longer. May the gods fell thee to the earth. I would I had a poisoned dagger by me to kill thee ere thou dost work thy treacherous will with me, thou son of slaves. May death overtake thee now. God in heaven grant that it may, O Caesar, said the prefect fervently. Now at last the houses became more sparse. Only here and there, up the side of the hill, a tiny light glittered feebly. Taurus Antinor's senses were only just sufficiently alert to keep in the right direction. The house which he wished to reach was not more than 600 steps away. The darkness had become almost thick in its intensity. Even the houses were undistinguishable in the gloom. The two men stumbled as they walked. Loose stones detached themselves under their feet, and their heelless sandals slid in the mud. Once the Caesar lost his foothold altogether, But for his convulsive hold on the prefect's arm, he would have measured his length in the mud. Taurus Antinor felt after the wrench as if this must be the end, as if body and brain and soul could not endure a moment longer and live. A mist akin to the one that enveloped the hill seemed to fall over his brain. He no longer walked now, he just stumbled along, blindly stumbling at almost every step with that dead weight upon his arm which an invisible force compelled him to carry up the precipitous height to the place of safety which was so far away. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Asked that heavenly murmur on the wings of memory. For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his work. With his burden lying like an insentient log on his arm, Taurus Antinor fell up at last against the door of the house. His foot had stumbled against his cornerstone. A moment or two later the door was opened from within, and the feeble light of the tiny lamp was held above him, whilst a kindly voice murmured, "Who goeth there?" "The Caesar is in danger and a fugitive. He asks shelter and protection from thee," murmured Taurus Antinor feebly, "and I would lay down my burden in thy house, for I am weary and I would find rest." "Enter, friend," said the man simply. The Caesar, trembling and nerveless, fell forward into the room. The prefect of Rome lay unconscious upon its threshold.
Chapter 34 of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Chapter 34. Finally, my brethren, be strong. Ephesians 6 verse 10. The younger men were still inclined to rebel. They felt that they were in great numbers, and that they were strong. They believed, with that optimism of excited youth, that their will must prevail in the end. In their opinion, the Caesar had done nothing to atone for his crime against the prefect of Rome, or for his dastardly cringing before the power of his people. But the older men, those who had mayhap more than once witnessed street rioting and the bloody reprisals that invariably followed upon rebellion, they counselled prudence, an acceptance of what had come about, since the imperial decree had been fixed to the rostrum of the great Augustus, promising pardon for all delinquencies. And what would you? But was not the prefect of Rome dead? The consul major had stated it positively to all those who asked the question of him, and he had it on the positive authority of Fulce, the prefect's most trusted slave. It was the consul major who, preceded by his lictors, had caused the imperial decree to be read out aloud to the people of Rome from the topmost steps of the Temple of Mars, and it was he who had then ordered the decree to be affixed to the wall of the rostrum. The consul major had received the precious parchment at the hands of the special messenger sent by the Caesar himself. That messenger was none other than Fulce, and he had stated positively that the prefect of Rome was dead. It was useless to demand that a man be proclaimed to the principate if that man be dead. True that some of the malcontents, those young men who were hot-headed and whose raging tempers were not easily curbed, refused to accept the news, and loudly demanded the body of the hero, so that divine honours might be accorded to it, to the lifelong shame of the Caesar who had so basely murdered him. But the praetor Urbanus had declared that the body of the prefect could not be found, and the rumour had gained ground that it had been defiled and thrown to the dogs. A sullen discontent reigned amongst the people for this, and it could not be allayed by all the promises of pardon and of rejoicing which the imperial proclamation decreed. There had been some calls too for Dea Flavia. The Caesar had nominated his successor to the imperium in the circus the other day. If the Augusta would but make her choice, the people would perhaps be ready to accept her lord now as consort imperi, with the ultimate hope that a just and brave man would succeed to the principate in due course. But no sound had as yet come from the house of Dea Flavia, and the people hung about the forum in desultory groups, discussing the situation. That the gods had intervened in the Caesar's favour no one could reasonably doubt, even whilst the anger of the populace was at its height, and dense masses had surrounded his palace to which he had been known to flee. He had been spirited away out of the city. His proclamation had come from Etruria, showing that he was already far from his city and on his way to join his legions. How did he succeed in making a way for himself through the dense masses that had thronged the streets for nigh on 48 hours, since first the tumults broke out in the circus when the praefect of Rome was stabbed? Had Jupiter sent down his thunders yesterday, his lowering clouds and heavy showers of rain, only in order to aid the Caesar in his progress? What hand had guided him down the declivities of the Palatine? What arm shielded him from the anger of the people? Dea Flavia had heard the news even as soon as the first hour of the day had been called. Yesterday, bruised in mind and heart and body, she had lain for close on an hour in a dreamless, semi-conscious state. It was only when she awoke from that the knowledge of her misery returned to her in full. She had found love, happiness, pride, all that makes life exquisite and fair, only to lose all these treasures even before she had had time to grasp them. Love had been called to life by the look, the touch of one man. Happiness had come when she saw the love light in his eyes, born in response to hers. Pride came with all the rich gifts which she could lavish upon him. Now everything was gone. He had taken everything from her, even as he gave it, and he took everything in order to offer it as a sacrifice to his God. Now her heart was numbed, and her brain tried in vain to conjure up the images of yesterday, the happy moments when she had lain against the noblest heart in Rome, but the only vision that her dulled senses could perceive was that of dying Menecreta speaking that awful curse, or of herself, Dea Flavia, gazing with eyes of anger and of pride into vacancy wherein her imagination had traced a glowing cross, and uttering words of defiance that seemed so futile, so sacrilegious now. The storm then had obscured the sky, drove the rain in heavy patter overhead. The air was dismal and dark. Now a brilliant sunshine flooded the imperial city with its radiance. The wet marble glistened in the dawn, and a roseate hue tipped the 7 hills of Rome with glory. But in Dea Flavia's heart there was only sorrow, darker than the blackest night. Sleep forsook her eyelids, and all night long she tossed about restlessly on her couch, listening to the sounds that came from the city in rebellion, counting them out as they died away one by one. She had gone to her room quite early in the day. Her guests, she knew, were being well looked after, and she could not bear to remain in the studio, whose every corner reminded her of that powerful personality which had lately filled it, and whose very walls still echoed with the sound of that rough voice, rendered at times so exquisitely tender. Blanca attended on her, and put her to bed, for she could not bear to have Licinia near her. The old woman's gossip jarred upon her nerves, and she was physically afraid to hear indifferent lips utter the name of the praefect of Rome. Only the call, "Hail, Taurus Antinor Caesar, hail!" which still came half the night through from afar, dulled her agony of mind for a few seconds when it struck upon her ear. It set her wondering, thus allowing her momentarily to forget her misery. Then she would lie, wide-eyed, looking upwards and pondering. Who was this god whom Taurus Antinor worshipped? Who was he, and what had he done? All she knew was that he had died upon a cross, the most ignominious death mortal man could suffer, and the praefect of Rome, the proud Roman patrician, had been content to obey him as a slave. Who was he, and what had he done? On this she pondered half the night through, while fever coursed through her veins, and her brows were moist and aching, her heart palpitating with pain. The dawn found her wearied and sick, but she rose when Blanca came to her in the first hour. She summoned Licinia and all her women, and ordered them to dress her in one of her richest robes. She looked very girlish and very pale when she stood decked out in the embroidered tunic which she had chosen. It was of a soft material, clinging to her graceful figure in long straight folds. There was some elaborate embroidery around the hem, below which her feet peeped out, clothed in sandals of gilt leather. When she was dressed, she went out into the atrium, and then sent word to the praetorian praefect and his friends that she was ready to receive them. Some of the news from the busy world outside had already reached her ears. Licinia was not like to be chary in imparting to her mistress the scraps of gossip which she had collected. The Caesar was outside the city. He would in due time return to Rome at the head of his legions, and in the meanwhile he had by a comprehensive and gracious act of clemency pardoned all those who had offended against his majesty. The noble patricians who yesterday had already deposed him, and had called on her to name his successor, had been foiled in their ambitious schemes by the very man whom she, Dea Flavia, would have set upon the throne. And once more that one all-absorbing puzzle confronted her. Who, and what was this God who had exacted this all-embracing sacrifice? She wandered somewhat aimlessly through the halls, for the great lords were not yet ready to appear before her, and as she crossed the atrium and went into the peristylium, looking with somewhat wistful longing toward the open portals of the vestibule and the vista of open air and the sky from whence a breath of pure fresh air struck pleasingly on her nostrils, she saw that in spite of the early hour a large number of the poorer clients, suppliants at the door of the great Augusta, had already assembled there. Foremost amongst them was an elderly man dressed in the plain garb of a slave, and wearing, embroidered on his tunic, the badge that proclaimed him in the service of the praefect of Rome. The man appeared to be very insistent, and to be receiving in consequence somewhat rough treatment from the janitors. Dea Flavia turned to one of her own slaves and ordered the man to be brought to her presence in the studio, where she would receive him. The man told the janitors that his name was Folce, that he belonged to the praefect of Rome and desired speech with the Augusta. He walked in very humbly, with back bent nearly double, and when he was shown into the studio where the Augusta sat alone, he fell on both knees before her. "Thy name is Folce, I am told," she began graciously, "and thou art of the household of the praefect of Rome." "I attend upon his person, gracious lady," replied the man. "And thou hast brought me a message from him?" she asked, even as with this hope her heart began to beat violently in her breast. "Not from him, gracious lady," said Folce humbly, "for the praefect of Rome is dead." "Who told thee that he was dead?" she asked. "Taurus Antinor named Anglicanus," replied the man simply. "He sent me my freedom this night, and a message to lay at the feet of Dea Flavia Augusta." "Give me the message," she said. Still on his knees, Folce fumbled in the folds of his mantle, and from his breast he drew a roll of parchment which he offered to the Augusta. "Rise, Folce, and go while I read," she said. "Wait outside the door till I do summon thee." She waited until the man had closed the heavy door behind him. She wanted to be alone with these last words which he had penned for her. Now she untied the string that held the roll together, then she unfolded the parchment and read: "Idol of my soul, beloved of my heart, aroused from dreams of thee, my wakening soul takes its last flight to thy feet. This is farewell, my dear, dear heart. Even as my hand pens the word, the dawn around me turns to the likeness of the night, and it is peopled with all the sorrows that wear out the heartstrings, slowly, one by one. The Caesar is safe. Even as I write, he starts forth on his way to join his legions. Having left him in charge of those who do not know how to betray, I succeeded in the night in reaching the detachment of the praetorian guard encamped around the circus. A small company of them returned with me to the lonely house in the Aventine, and from thence at break of day they started with the Caesar toward Etruria, where the legions home from the expedition against the Alemanni were still known to abide. In 3 or 4 days, or mayhap 5, the Caesar will re-enter his city. His proclamation of pardon is so worded that his keeping of his word is closely bound up both with his honour and his personal safety. The people therefore have naught to fear from his vengeance. Those who have more actively conspired against him, and who would have drawn thee in their selfish schemes, have time before them to put themselves and their belongings out of the immediate reach of the Caesar. Tell them to live in retirement, as far from Rome as they can, until such time as the events of the past few days have been erased from the tablets of memory. The Caesar is safe, and I, dear heart, do bid thee a last farewell. When I parted from thee yesterday, we both knew then that the parting would be for ever. Even though thine exquisite hands clung to me and twined themselves round the very fibres of my soul, and thy voice called me back with the ineffable sweetness of thy love, I knew that it would be for ever. The Caesar will never forgive me that I witnessed his abject humiliation, and even at dawn, when he stood surrounded by his praetorian guard, as secure from danger as human agency could make him, a gleam of hatred shone in his eyes whenever he looked on me. He never would give thee to me, dear heart, and would vent his wrath also upon thy dear head. 'Tis better that he too should think me dead, for dead will I be to Rome, and to the people among whom my name might yet give cause for strife and for discontent. The Caesar is safe, and I can go my ways in peace. He hath no longer need of me, but my Lord hath called, and I his servant must take up my cross and follow him. The priceless gifts which thy pure hands did hold out to me are registered in his book of heaven, and he never forgets. As for me, I were less or more than a man were I to ask thee to forget. I would have thee remember. Yet would I think of thee as happy and radiant as the stars wherewith he hath gladdened the darkness of our nights. But think not of me as unhappy. My Lord hath called, and I the servant am bound to follow. He laid a burden on me, and this burden must I bear, even though I may bear with it all the pain that is greater than the pain of the earth, greater than the ceaseless travail of the sea, even though I may bear with it that bitterest of all bitter fruits, the labour that is nothing worth. That I know not. Who knoweth? O God, truly not I. There was grief in the world, dear heart, even before the stars were made, or the sky stretched its blue dome above. And as hour follows hour, day succeeds day, and the cycles of years come and go, even so do fresh griefs and greener sorrows spring around us. Like each recurrent season, they too come and go. Only one thing abideth, dear heart, and that is the will of God, who made happiness and woe, love and pain, sleep and death. And 'tis the will of God that I should lose thee and yet continue to live, even though life to me henceforth will be one long dream of death. Idol of my soul, beloved of my heart, farewell. I go to find comfort from that bitter word, on the summit of Golgotha, at the foot of an abandoned broken cross. When my soul hath found peace, then will it be ready for the service of God. Farewell, my beloved. May God have thee in his keeping, even as thy soul hath already been touched with his grace. Farewell. Mine eyes are dim, my hand trembles, hot tears blur the writing on this parchment, and as I look up through the open doorway, to where the limitless horizon lies beyond Rome's 7 hills, I see stretched out before me the long vista of years, throughout which my heart will be for ever weaving with threads of longing and of sorrow the tether which binds undying memory to thee. Her hands, which held the roll of parchment, dropped down upon her lap. Her eyes too were dim, and the hot tears fell from them one by one. A sadness that was in no way bitter, and yet was immeasurable as death, had filled her entire being as she read. Slowly she laid the parchment in the bosom of her tunic. Then, like one who walks in sleep, she rose and crossed the studio. Her hand, white and slightly quivering, pushed back the heavy door that masked the inner room. Silently it swung upon its hinges, disclosing the sanctum where yesterday the stricken hero had lain helpless and sick. The couch had not been touched since he had laid on it. It still bore the imprint of the massive figure as it lay inert in the embrace of drugged sleep. The pillow only had been smoothed out as if by a loving hand, and as Dea Flavia came nearer to it, she saw that a small object had been laid there, as if reverently, right in the centre. The tears in her eyes obscured her vision momentarily, but when they fell one by one down her cheeks, she saw a little more clearly, and having approached the couch, she took up the small object that lay there upon the pillow. It was the wooden cross which she had last seen held between the clasped hands of the man whom she loved. She gazed on the small symbol, and gazed, even though the tears gathered thick and fast in her eyes, and the image that she saw was scarce discernible as it rested in her hand. How puzzled had she been 2 nights ago when she stole softly into this room and saw him kneeling here beside the couch, clasping this wooden symbol between his fingers, intertwined in a gesture of passionate prayer. She had been puzzled because his actions of the day before had seemed incomprehensible to her. His attitude to my lord Hortensius Martius, an enemy whose life he had saved at risk of his own, his loyalty to the Caesar whom everyone abhorred. All this had puzzled her then, but how infinitely more profound was that puzzle now! A riddle more mysterious than any sage could propound lay hidden in the words of the letter which she had just read. The man who had penned that letter had poured out his heart in it, and it was not a heart that was void of pity or of love. It brimmed over with pity, it was bruised with the intensity of love, but, crushed and broken though it was, it did not murmur, it only endured. Dea Flavia looked down upon the small object which to Taurus Antinor had been an emblem of that God whom he worshipped, and who had been man and had died a shameful death. Who was this God whom Taurus Antinor worshipped, for whose sake and at whose bidding he was content to give up all the super heights of ambition to which a Roman patrician could aspire? Who was this God, and what had he done that a man like Taurus Antinor, a man filled with all a man's strength and all a man's heroism, a man worshipped of the people and glorified by an entire nation, should thus give up the lordship of Rome in order to do him service? That he should give it up too, without a murmur, content to offer this final and absolute sacrifice. Think not of me as unhappy. My Lord has called me, and I, his servant, am bound to follow. Thus had the man written in loneliness and in peace after the sacrifice had been accomplished, even after she, the Augusta, had, with love-filled heart and generous hands, offered him everything that man could desire on this earth. He had written it in loneliness and in peace, having given up the world to follow his God. Who was this God, and what had he done that his power over Taurus Antinor's heart was greater than her own? Yesterday she had cursed him loudly and called him cruel and unjust. 4 days ago she had defied him, and now he had conquered. Taurus Antinor had obeyed him, and she who loved him and whom he loved was left desolate. For this she never doubted. He loved her, that she knew. She was no child now. The last 4 days had made a woman of her. In the past 4 days she had tasted of and witnessed every passion that rends a human heart. Love, ambition, cruelty, hatred, she had seen them all. Seen through passion men brought down to a level lower than the beasts, and through passion a man become equal to a god. No, she was no longer a child, she was a woman now, and there was much that, if she did not understand, she at least could not doubt. The man whom she loved her with an intensity at least equal to that which even now made her heart throb at the memory of his kiss. He loved her, longed for her, would have laid down his life for her even at the moment when he tore himself away from her arms. He loved her and longed for her, even whilst his trembling fingers penned this last impassioned farewell. He loved her, and he loved Rome, but his God called to him, and he, the proud Roman patrician, the accepted lord of the Augusta and of Rome, followed as would a slave. Slowly she dropped down on her knees, just where he too had knelt 2 nights ago, and like unto him she clasped her hands together, scarce conscious that the tiny wooden cross still lay between her fingers. "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean," she murmured, whilst great sobs that would not be suppressed rose to her throat. "At thy call he left everything that makes life beautiful and happy. At thy call he left me to mourn. He left the people of Rome who acclaimed him. He left the throne of Augustus and the empire of the world. Everything he left at thy call. What hast thou in thy nail-pierced hands to give him in return?" For a while now she was able to give way to her immeasurable sorrow. Her head buried in the pillow whereon his head had rested, she sobbed out her loving, aching heart in a passionate fit of weeping. Just like the Christian yesterday up on the heights, so was she, the pagan, alone now with her grief. More lonely than he, she had no anchorage, and in her ear had never sounded those all-compelling words, sublime in their perfect gentleness, "Come unto me." But who shall tell what divine hand soothed her burning forehead, what divine words of comfort was whispered in her ear? Gradually her tears ceased to flow, the heavy sobs were stilled, her aching and bruised body felt numb with the pain in her heart, but outwardly she was more calm. She rose from her knees, and hiding the small cross in the bosom of her gown, she drew forth the letter and read it through once more. "If only I knew," she murmured, "if only I could understand." After a while she bethought her of the slave Folces, the one human link left now between herself and the man whom she loved and who was gone from her. With reverent hand she smoothed out the couch, the pillow which had supported his head, the coverlet which had lain over him. She was loth to go from this room whose every corner seemed still to hold something of his personality, and whose every wall seemed to hold an echo of his voice. She would have stayed here for hours longer, talking to that absent personality, powerful and mysterious more than ever now, listening to the rugged voice which she would never hear again. But there was something that she must do ere she gave herself over finally to her dreams. There was a duty to accomplish which she knew he would ask of her. Therefore, after a last, long, all-embracing look on the place which would for ever be as a sanctuary in her sight, she went back to the studio at last, and herself going to the door, she called Folces back to her. "The praefect of Rome, good Folces," she asked as soon as the man had entered. "Wilt see him again?" "Taurus Antinor, named Anglicanus, hath left Rome to-day on his way to Syria, O Augusta," said the man, humbly insisting on the name of his master. "Dost not go with him?" "He hath commanded me to stay here, and to look after his household until such time as he doth direct." "His household?" she said. "I had not thought of that. What is to become of his house in Rome? His villa at Ostia, and his slaves?" "The praefect of Rome," said Folces, "made ere he died a testament wherein he did command the freedom of all his slaves, and ordered a certain sum of money to be set aside which will enable even the humblest amongst us all to live decently like freedmen. The house in Rome and the villa at Ostia are to be sold, whilst the remainder of Taurus Antinor's private fortune is to be administered by his general agents. He said that he would see to it later on. I am still his slave. He did not confide in me." "Yet he asked thee to look after his household?" "It will take a little time until the manumissio testamento can take effect. In the meanwhile we are all Taurus Antinor's slaves, and must look after his houses until they have been sold." "Wilt be happy as a freedman, Folces?" "Yes, Augusta," replied the man simply, "for then I shall be at liberty to follow Taurus Antinor as his servant." She sat quite silently after this, her tear-stained eyes fixed into vacancy. Folces was on his knees, waiting to be dismissed. It was some little while before she remembered his presence. Then in a gentle voice she bade him go. "Should I take a message back to my master?"
Chapter 35 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 35. Quote, "We are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do." End quote. Luke Chapter 17, verse 10. Half an hour later, Dea Flavia Augusta was in the tablinum. She had received Caius Nepos, the Praetorian prefect, Marcus Ancyrus the elder, my lords Hortensius Martius, Philippus Decius, and the others, and they, who had heard so many conflicting rumours throughout the morning, and were beginning to quake with fear, for none of the rumours were reassuring, were grouped, trembling and expectant, around her. "My lords," she began, as soon as she had received their obsequious greetings, "I know not if you have heard the news. The Caesar hath succeeded in quitting Rome. He is on his way to rejoin his legions, and nothing can stand in the way of his progress. In a few days from now he will make his state re-entry into the city, and the city will resound from end to end with rejoicings in his honour." "We had all heard the news, Augusta," said Caius Nepos, who was vainly trying to steady his voice and to appear calm and dignified. "And also that a proclamation of pardon hath preceded the entry of the Caesar into Rome, and hath been affixed to the rostrum of the great Augustus by the consul major himself this morning." "And what do you make of all this, my lords?" she asked. "That some gods of evil have been at work," muttered young Escanes between set teeth, "and spirited the tyrannical madman out of the way for the further scourging of his people." "The spirit, my lords," she interposed quietly, "that led my kinsman to safety last night was one which actuated the noblest patrician in Rome to do his duty loyally by the Caesar." "Then curse him for a traitor," muttered Caius Nepos, whose cheeks had become white with terror. "He was no traitor to you, my lords," she retorted hotly, "for he was not one of you. He was true to the oath which he had rendered to the Caesar, aye, even to the Caesar whom we, my lords, all of us here present, had been ready to betray." Then, as she saw nothing but sullen faces around her, and not a word broke the silence that ensued, she continued more calmly. "Yesterday you came to me, my lords, with proposals of treachery, to which I, alas, did listen, because in my heart I had already chosen one man who I felt was worthy to rule over this great empire. I had made my choice, and myself offered him the imperium, the throne of Augustus, and the sceptre of the Caesars. But he refused it all, my lords, and went forth in the night to place himself body and heart at the Caesar's service." "And his name, O Augusta?" queried Ancyrus the elder. "He hath name Taurus Antinor, and was once prefect of Rome." "He is dead," broke in Hortensius Martius hotly. "He lived long enough, my lord," she retorted, "to show us all our duty." There was silence after that, for many a heart was beating spasmodically with fear or with hope. My lord Hortensius Martius sat on a low stool, with his elbow on his knee, his chin buried in his hand. His eyes, glowing with dull and sullen hatred, searched the face of Dea Flavia, trying to read what went on behind the pure straight brow and those liquid blue eyes, deep as the fathomless sea. "What is to be done?" said Ancyrus the elder, with a pitiable look of perplexity directed at the Augusta. "To make our submission to the Caesar," she said simply, "those of us at least who are not afraid of his wrath. For the others there is still time to seek a safe retreat far away from Rome." "But this is monstrous!" cried Hortensius Martius, suddenly jumping to his feet, and beginning to pace up and down the room in an outburst of impotent wrath. "This is miserable, cowardly, abject. What? Would ye allow that stranger, that son of slaves, to thwart your plans by his treachery? Are we naughty children that can thus be sent, well whipped and whining, to bed? Up, my lords, this is not the end. Caesar is not yet in Rome. The people are still dissatisfied. Hark to the noise in the forum below. Does it sound as if the populace was accepting the news with rejoicing? Up now, my lords, it is not too late. Acclaim your new Caesar. It is not too late, I say. When the legions return with that mountebank at their head, let them find Dea Flavia Augusta and her lord the acknowledged masters of Rome." He looked flushed, excited and proud, feeling that even at this 11th hour he could carry these men along with him if Dea Flavia put the weight of her power on his side. Now he paused in his peroration, standing above his fellow conspirators as if already he were their ruler, and looking from one face to the other with eager, restless eyes that expressed all his enthusiasm and all his hopes. But the two older men had evidently no stomach for the situation as it now was. It had been easy matter enough to murder the Caesar treacherously, and while his legions were 3 days' march away. But now everything was very different, the issues very doubtful. No doubt that a safe retreat away from the city would be by far the wiser course. Caius Nepos, with vivid recollections of his last interview with the Caesar, shook his head with slow determination, and Cyrus the elder was silent, and only the 3 younger men had followed Hortensius Martius in his heated argument. "What sayest thou, Augusta?" asked Philippius Decius at last, looking doubtfully upon the young girl. "That ye must make your plans without me, my lords," she said coldly. "Since, as you say, the prefect of Rome is dead, I can make no choice worthy of him who is gone. I choose to return to mine allegiance, my loyalty to the Caesar and to my house." "If the Caesar returns," urged Hortensius Martius, "he will vent some of his wrath on thee." "Then I will suffer for my treachery, my lords," she rejoined proudly, "in accordance with my deserts." "But Augusta—" "I pray you, my lord," she interposed haughtily, "do not prolong your arguments. My mind is made up, and you value your own safety in the future, 'twere wiser to make preparations for a lengthy stay away from Rome." "Hadst thou listened to us yesterday," sighed Ancyrus the elder. "A heavy crime had lain against us all," she said. "Be thankful, my lords, that in the history of Rome, when it comes to be written, your deed will not have sullied the page that marks today. And now, my lords, I bid you farewell. You are in no danger if you leave the city forthwith. The rejoicings at the entry of the Caesar and the homecoming of his legions will last many days. During that time your names will be erased from the tablets of my kinsman's memory." "The gods grant it," murmured Caius Nepos. "But thou, Augusta, what of thee?" "I, my lords," she said with a gentle smile, the irony of which was lost in their self-centered intellects, "I pray have no thoughts of me. I have been placed in the keeping of one who, I am told, is mightier than Caesar. There I must be safe. So farewell, my lords. We meet again, I hope, in happier and more peaceful times." She stood up, and one by one, for was she not still the Augusta and the favourite kinswoman of the Caesar, they bent the knee before her and kissed the hem of her gown, after which act of homage they retired with backs bent and walking backwards out of the room. My lord Hortensius Martius was the last to take his leave. He went down on both knees, and would have encircled the Augusta with his arms, only she drew back quickly a step or two. "Dea, in the name of my love for thee," he began. But she interrupted him gently yet firmly. "Speak not to me of love, my lord," she said. "'Tis but love's ghost that moves to and fro when you speak." Then, as he would have protested, she put up her hand with a gesture of finality. "It is no use, my lord. What love there is in me, that you never could have aroused, not even in the past. I entreat you not to insist. Love cannot be compelled. It is or is not. Whence it comes we know not. Mayhap the gods do know. Mayhap there is only one who knows. And he seems to give much, but also to take all. Therefore mayhap love comes from him, and when we are not prepared to give up all for love's sake, then doth he withhold the supreme gift, and leave our hearts barren. Mayhap, mayhap." She sighed. "Ah, alas, I know not. And you, good my lord, do not look so puzzled and so scared. I bid you farewell now. I'll not forget you. To remember is so much easier than to love." He had perforce to accept his dismissal. He felt rebellious against fate, and would have liked to have forced her will. But as she stood there before him, clad all in white, so young and so chaste, and yet a woman who knew what love was, an awed reverence for her crept into his heart, and he felt that indeed he would never dare to speak again to her of love. He too kissed the hem of her tunic now, just as the others had done, and just as they had done, Chapter 36 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 36. Quote, The peace of God, which passeth all understanding. End quote. Philippians chapter 4, verse 7. 3 months had gone by since then. Rome had acclaimed the Caesar and rejoiced over his homecoming. There were holidays and spectacles, chariot races and gladiatorial combats, and the people of Rome forgot that it had ever shouted, Hail, Taurus Antenor Caesar, hail! Now the calls were for Caius Julius Caesar Caligula, and those who had most loudly shouted for his death cringed most obsequiously at his feet. The very name of the ex-prefect of Rome was already forgotten. His testament, made, it appears, just before his death, had been copiously commented on at first. All his slaves had received their freedom, together with a sufficient sum to enable one and all to live in comfort in the new state of freedom. The rest of the vast property owned by the late prefect was being somewhat mysteriously administered, and up to this hour no one had been able to gain any definite information with regard to its ultimate destination. There were those who averred that a great deal of ready money, including the proceeds of the sale of the late prefect's house in Rome and of his villa at Ostia, had found its way to a section of very poor freedmen who lived on the Aventine, and who formed a somewhat isolated little colony not viewed altogether kindly by the official magistracy of the city. But all that was mere gossip, and did not withstand the test of time. After 3 months, people had plenty of other matters to think of and to talk about. There were the festivals and games which had accompanied the re-entry of the Caesar into Rome. The city had been beflagged and adorned with banners and with garlands. For 30 days did the rejoicings last, and brilliant sunshine shone over the golden glories of autumn, and kissed the foliage of oleanders until they blushed a brilliant crimson, and tinged the marble of palaces and temples every morning with rose. The games in the great circus went on without intermission for 30 days. There were military and naval pageants, combats between the lions from Numidia and the new hyenas and crocodiles. There were gladiatorial contests and chariot races. Much human blood was shed for the delectation of the masters of the world, much skill displayed, much prowess vanquished by prowess greater, much valour laid to dust. But the Caesar's pet black panther did not appear again in the circus. The mighty fist of the dead prefect had mayhap laid the creature low. In any case, it were not safe to reawaken dormant memories. And Caius Julius Caesar Caligula, the father of his armies, the best and greatest of Caesars, showed himself at all these pageants more crazed than ever. He hardly ever spoke now to the people. 'Twas averred that Caesonia, his wife, had given him a potion to cure him of his infatuation for Dea Flavia, his kinswoman, whom he had exalted above all other Augustas, and whose absence from Rome and from all festivities had rendered him half distracted with wrath. He would have liked to vent that wrath on Dea, but he could not lay hands on her. She had left her palace even before his re-entry into Rome, taking none but 2 of her most trusted slaves with her. The others did not know whither she had gone. Some thought that she had gone on a journey to a villa which she possessed in Sicilia. Others thought that she was living a life of retirement in a lonely dwelling on the Sabine hills, preparatory to devoting her virginity to the glory of Vesta. Caius Julius Caesar Caligula prepared to have her sought for throughout the length and breadth of his empire, and would no doubt have succeeded in time in this search, had not a few months later Chaerea, the praetorian tribune, done the work with his hands which the dagger of young Escanes had failed to do. The winter had been slow in coming, but it had come at last. An icy wind blew from across the sea. Overhead the sky was the colour of lead, and great banks of clouds chased one another wantonly above the hills that tower over Jerusalem. There was hardly a path up the rugged incline. The rains and winds and snows of the past 7 years had obliterated the marks which a surging crowd had once made in the wake of the sacred feet. It was close on the 9th hour, and the shadows of evening were already drawing in very fast. A tall figure dressed in sombre garments walked slowly up the hill which is called Calvary. His head was uncovered, and he had no wand wherewith to ease his footsteps. The blustering gusts of wind blew the tawny hair over his brow. He held his head erect, and his eyes did not watch the places where trod his feet. They were fixed on ahead, up toward the summit of the hill, there where a cross stood broken and lonely, with wooden arms outstretched and the birds of heaven circling all round it. Every day for 7 days now had the pilgrim wandered up the steep, desolate hill. Every day for 7 days he had reached the summit ere the 9th hour was called from the city walls. He lived at a small inn just inside the 3rd wall, and every day at noon he set out on his pilgrimage, and only came home when the darkness of night lay dense upon the valley. Today he was more weary than he had ever been before. His feet felt like leaden weights that seemed to be dragging him down and ever downwards, and the loneliness of the place had its image within his heart. On the summit he fell on his knees, and knelt at the foot of the cross, leaning his aching forehead against the cold, dank wood. "How long, oh my God, how long?" he murmured. "The misery is more than I can bear. I am ready to do thy work, O God, to speak thy word where thou dost bid me go. But take her image, dear Lord, from before mine eyes. It stands for ever twixt thy cross and me. Break my heart, O God, since her image fills it, and its every beat is not in thy name. Take the cup from me, dear Lord. It is too bitter, and I cannot drink." The night drew in around him. The lights in the city below were extinguished one by one. The croaking birds on the lonely cross had found a home far away in the gloom. The pilgrim knelt against the cross. He could hardly see the objects nearest to him, the small prickly shrubs, the rough grass, the loose stones that looked so white and spectral in the waning light. He could hardly see, for his eyes ached with the dull misery of tears that would not fall. But suddenly a sound softer than that made by a night-bird in its flight struck upon his ear. It was like the drawing of a garment upon the rugged ground. 1 or 2 small stones detached themselves from their bed of wet earth and rolled away from under the tread of feet that walked upwards towards the summit. The pilgrim did not move, and yet he heard the sound. It came nearer to him, and nearer. And suddenly he was not alone. Something living and warm knelt on the stony ground beside him, and gentle fingers that had the softness and the coolness of snow were laid upon his burning hands. "I came as quickly as I could," said a tender voice close to his ear. "But it has taken me some time to find thee. Had it not been for Falses and his devotion, I might mayhap never have found thee. We came to Jerusalem yesterday. Today at noon I saw thee starting forth from out the city. I followed thee, but the way was rough. I feared I should never reach the summit, and yet 'twas here I wished to speak to thee." All this while he had remained numb and silent. He knew even when first her hand touched his that God had ended his sorrow and taken his aching soul into his keeping at last. But for the moment he thought that sweet death had kissed his eyelids, and that this was the first taste of paradise. Darkness was closing in around them both. He could scarcely distinguish her features, but it seemed to him as if glory shone out of her eyes, glory so radiant that it illuminated the darkness and pierced the walls of the night. "Is it thou?" he murmured. "O God, have pity on me. Her image, her sweet image, allow it to fade from my mind ere my brain becomes a traitor to thee." "'Tis not a vision, dear heart," she whispered softly. "'Tis not a dream. It is I, Dea Flavia, whom thou didst call the beloved of thy heart. I came because I loved thee, and because here on this spot I would learn from thee the mysteries of thy God." "Is it thou? And hast thou come to me from heaven?" "No, dear heart, only from far off Rome. And I have come to thee, to be with thee, and to follow thee wherever thou wilt lead me." Yet will my wanderings lead me far, he said. My Lord has called, and I must go. Then I will go with thee, she said. To far-off lands, dear heart, to speak the word of God to those who heard it not. I will go with thee, she reiterated simply. To far-off lands whence I came, a sea-girt land which was once mine own. My fathers lived there. I would go back and tell my people of all that I saw here on Calvary 7 years ago. Then thither will I go with thee, she replied. Thy home will be my home, thy people my people, and thy God shall be my God, for thine am I now and always. I am ignorant yet, but this I do know, that thy God must be the great, the true and only God. None other God but he could have put in thy heart the strength of sacrifice which hath brought thee, who had Rome at thy feet, a lonely wanderer to the foot of this cross. She knelt beside him, and he no longer cowered. Limitless joy was in his heart, and immeasurable gratitude. For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. The wings of the wind brought the sacred words to his ears. He kissed the rough wooden cross, there where the divine feet had rested, and Dea Flavia pressed her lips on it too, and the peace that passeth all understanding descended upon them both. Overhead the clouds had parted, their silver lining showed clearly against the dull blue sky, and in the midst of that rent in the firmament, far away in the limitless beyond, a star shone out bright and clear. Then they both rose, and hand in hand they walked slowly down the hill.